Saran Henderson. I'm a midwife and I have a midwifery service in Atlanta, Georgia. I call my service Birth in the Tradition. The reason why I call it Birth in the Tradition is because over the years of my services, I began to realize that there were a lot of traditional practices throughout the world that were evidence-based, that were proven to be effective amongst traditional cultures, whether they were from here in the United States amongst the Native Americans or African women, Hispanic women, women from Asia, women from Australia. And I realized that over the years, over the decades, a lot of the traditional customs and practices of pregnancy and birth were lost. And a lot of those practices were valuable practices that were proven to be effective. And so I wanted to learn more about these traditional practices and implement them in my practice so that I can reawaken or reteach what used to be taught by our grandmothers so that we can continue to pass on those traditional practices and knowledge and experiences and customs to our daughters, to our nieces, to our neighbors, to our church, and begin to see value in those. And so that's how Birth in the Tradition got its name. I actually began my path into midwifery in, I would say, probably in 1979 during my pregnancy with my first child. Although I was not pursuing midwifery, I did become interested in childbirth. I was expecting my husband and I, our first child, like I said, and I was very interested in having my baby at home. My husband and I chose to have home births, not only with our first one, but with all 5 of our children, because we wanted to be a part of our lifestyle. It wasn't based on fad. It wasn't based on, being the hip thing to do. We were embracing a natural lifestyle as we were young in our marriage, and we just thought that this would be embracing it. So while I was pregnant, we read lots of books on childbirth. We read books about midwifery. And there weren't very many at that time, but the few that we did have our hands on, special delivery, spiritual midwifery, we read those books back and forth. And then having friends who were having their babies at home, we listened to their stories. And we decided that we would get started with prenatal care. And so we found a doctor that we thought would be suitable to us and that should or might support what plans that we had. And as the pregnancy furthered along, I started realizing that he was very medically orientated, and I think at one point I started getting discouraged with him because there was no interaction that was going on between he and I. And he was from Africa, and I guess I was thinking that because he was from Africa that he was accustomed to home birth and that was the norm, and he just turned out to be a little bit more westernized than some of these doctors here, and told me that my thinking was backwards thinking and that even the women in Africa were beginning to have their babies at home, and wasn't supporting my idea of having our baby at home. But I continued to continue with him until I got to my 7th month in my pregnancy. And at that point, he told me that he felt like I needed to start preparing myself for a C-section. And I couldn't understand why. I never had an ultrasound. I don't remember ever having a pelvic exam, but he told me that he didn't think that I was capable of delivering my baby vaginally, and I could not see why I couldn't. I told him that there were no women in my family who had ever had a C-section before, and I wasn't intending on being the first one. So when he told me that, then I realized at that point we were in the latter part of our pregnancy and that it was time to get busy and find a midwife. And we did. It didn't take very long for us to find the midwife of our choice, and she was very encouraging about having a home birth and told me the things I needed to get in preparation for it, different supplies to get. And one day on the 4th of July, 1979, my body started rumbling. That's what I call it. Started rumbling, and I woke up surprised that people were barbecuing. It was like 6 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't believe people were already barbecuing so early in the morning. And I nudged my husband. I was like, I think I might be in labor. And it was early labor. It was very early labor, but having not anything to compare with, I thought that it was true labor. Well, I didn't give birth to him until the midnight hours of the 6th of July, so a good almost 48 hours, not quite, but almost 48 hours later, I finally gave birth to my son. And the kind of feeling that I had, which I think is a feeling that most women have after they give birth to their baby vaginally, you get this feeling like, I did it. Especially when you've been told that you can't do it. And it gives you this feeling that if I can do this, I can do anything. And so that's how I felt. I felt what we call empowered. I felt like I could do, anything at that point. And that's what I think that home birth does for people. I think that's what vaginal births, regardless whether it's at home or in the hospital, when women do exercise the strength and the courage and everything to let your body open up and let a child come through, it does empower you and it does make you feel like you can do anything. And I think that this feeling helps you to conquer fears that you might have in any other aspect of your life, whether you're looking for a job or looking for the right relationship. It gives you a certain amount of confidence, I believe. I think it's embedded in our cellular memory. Well, little did I know that at the time that I gave birth, my midwife herself was expecting a baby. And later on, well, she was 6 months she was early in her pregnancy. 6 months later, she gave birth to her child, and her birth experience is probably one of the most profound experiences that put me on the path to midwifery. I was invited to attend her birth about a month before she gave birth. And when she went to labor, I was called along with a friend of mine who was a mutual friend of hers. The two of us went to her home together, and she labored and labored and labored. She had a very long labor. Her labor went on well beyond 2 days, and but she had the strength and she had the courage to keep on going, and eventually she did give birth to her baby as well. When her baby was born not breathing. Her baby was born bluish, and I don't think that her midwife knew exactly what to do, so she gave the baby to my midwife and told her, here, you take your baby, talk to your baby, let your baby hear your voice, because he's not responding to me. So she took her baby, and she was Muslim at the time. And so she whispered a prayer into the baby's ear. They call it the adhan. And then all of a sudden the baby just woke up and just cried and cried and cried. And I was like, wow, this is the most awesome thing I have ever seen. That prayer woke that baby up out of his deep sleep. And I was really proud. I was really amazed. I was in awe. I couldn't believe what I saw, and it was just so beautiful. Well, she gave birth early in the evening, and I hung out with her for the rest of that evening, well into the night, and sat by her side as I listened to her share her experience with me. I was sitting on the floor next to her bed, and she told me that it was my hands that comfort her the most, that when the contractions got almost unbearable, I instinctively knew where to touch her, massage her, and that helped to ease her. And then she says, "Let me see your hands." So I gave her my hands, and she looked at my hands, and she rubbed my hands, and she said, "These are the hands of a midwife." She said, "If you would like for me to train these hands, I will." I thought that was an honor for her to even have said that to me. And so I said, okay. Well, it's customary in my family to take things like that to our elders. So I told my mother what she said, and she was like, "Do it. That sounds like something you would enjoy doing." I took it to my grandmother, and she was like, "Do it." Back in the days, black women, that's all the choice they ever had, really, was to have their babies at home with midwives. Your mother was born at home. I was born at home. Just remember to take God with you to each birth. So having gotten the approval of my mother and my grandmother, I decided to keep on with this mission that was ahead of me. And a month later, I get a call. Just out the clear blue sky, a woman calls me, and she tells me that she wants me to be her midwife. And then a couple days later, another lady calls me and tells me that she wants me to be her midwife. And both times I told them, I am not a midwife. I may have had my baby at home and witnessed my midwife giving birth to her baby at home, but I am not a midwife. And both of them, by the way, these two women did not know each other, but both of them were like, we're going to have our babies at home regardless whether you're there or not. But because you've had the experience of giving birth to your baby at home, and because you have witnessed a baby being born at home from the other end of the bed, that qualifies you to at least be our support person. So I said, okay. So again, I took it to my grandmother, and I told her, what had been coming to me through these women. And she says, just remember, take God with you. She said, you must be answering the request or the prayers or taking on the art of midwifery from your grand aunt Alice, which was my great grandmother's sister. She said that they used to call her the country doctor. She lived in Augusta, Georgia, and women would come to her whenever they were pregnant and needed a midwife, and all sorts of people would come to her for herbs, and she knew how to set bones. So I guess maybe I did take on some of her spirit, at least. And the first woman went into labor a month later. Now, let me give you a timeline. My baby, my first child, was born in July. This is July 1979. My midwife had her baby 6 months later, March 1980. The first lady had her baby in May, and she had a little boy. I've lost touch with them. They moved out to California. I don't recall her name, but I remember the little boy's name was Akram. And then the next month, the other lady who had contacted me had her baby. That was in May, and that was a little girl. And since then, I've delivered 2 of her children. So at this point now, I'm on my second generation of babies. Well, anyways, the word got around in our community that I was delivering babies, and I was accepting the call. And I think I might have delivered maybe 3 more babies up until October. And then finally, my midwife got back on board. She had taken an extended postpartum leave, but she was ready to get busy again, and she called me up and told me that she was starting her practice again and asked me if I was ready to start apprenticing with her, and I told her yes. And so I did. And off to births we went. And so I guess one of the reasons why I decided that I wanted to do this when I committed to doing it for her was that I felt like my experience was a positive experience, and my experience with my midwife was positive as well. And the other births that I was doing, I saw the effects that they had. And I felt like if I can have this kind of experience and help another woman have an experience similar to mine, then I would fully accept the roles and the responsibility of learning and becoming a midwife. Well, that year, it wasn't just myself that decided to take on the calling of midwifery. And I call it a calling in its true sense because I had just graduated from school the year before, getting my degree in education. I went to Clark Atlanta University, and I got a degree in early childhood education, thinking that I would become a teacher like many of my family members, my mother, aunts, uncles, grandmother, great-grandmother. They were all educators. And so I had just graduated. And I knew that I was going to be a stay-at-home mom for as long as possible, but I figured that if mommies were calling me to be there at the birth, this must be a calling. And so I'm answering a call. And as long as moms continue to call me, I'll still consider this as a calling. It's not my formal educational training, as it is a skill that came over time, and what I call the Creator anointing my hands. That's the only thing I can give it. Well, as I continued to study and read and study, at this point now, I'm reading every book that I can find in the library, in the bookstores, anywhere I could find books about childbirth, about midwifery, about newborn care, about breastfeeding. I would just read and read. I enjoy reading. I still enjoy reading. But I started realizing that of all the midwifery books that I read, when it came to the history of midwifery, it was more or less giving the history of the Caucasian midwife, the European midwife. And I knew that the history of midwifery in the black community was totally different, because our history in coming to the Americas and the European history in coming to the Americas are two different history points. But I didn't have any other resources to go to other than hearing the stories of people like my grandmother and my grand aunts and my great grandmothers, and listening to other older women sharing their experiences and having their baby at home with the granny midwife. Until, I guess maybe about a year later, there was a film that was being shown downtown. It was a documentary that was produced in 1957, I believe, by the Georgia Health Department. And the name of this film is called All My Babies. And so somebody had called me up and told me that this film was going to be shown at the library downtown, and I should go and check it out. So I was very curious to see what this was about. And so I went. And the video, it was not video, the documentary was actually produced so that it could be used as a teaching aid to teach granny midwives the importance of cleanliness during childbirth. So I watched this, and my eyes were just glued to the film. My ears were just tuned into every word that was being said. And I realized that this film was actually filmed here in Georgia, in Albany, Georgia, which is about south as you can get in Georgia. And it was a film about Miss Mary, Miss Mary Cooling. And with this documentary, you follow her. Well, she's following two women. One that's a pretty well-to-do black family that lives in the town, in the city of Albany, as well as blacks could get at that point, but they were good. And then the other family was a poor farmer family that lived out in the country. And so you see the differences in the outcome of the births and how the women, each woman took care of herself. The cameras followed her to Miss Mary to the clinic where the women would go for their prenatal care to be seen by the doctor. And you see how women are encouraged or either not encouraged to have their babies at home based on what the doctor tells them. So if their blood pressure was too high, then the doctor would have to attend to their birth. If they seemed to be low risk and fine, then Miss Mary was the one who, delivered their babies. So these two ladies, they went on to have their babies, and I watched the film all the way to the end. I wrote down the name of the county, the name of the city, and raced home so I can start finding out about this lady, Miss Mary. As soon as I got home, I called down to the main hospital in Albany, Georgia, and asked to speak to somebody in labor and delivery. And someone from labor and delivery answered the phone. I told them what I had just seen, and the lady was familiar with the film and told me to call back tomorrow and speak to somebody in the health department, which she gave me her name and her telephone number. That next morning I called and told the lady that I was interested in learning more about the history of the black midwife in Georgia. And she was like, well, honey, everything you want to know about the history of midwifery in Georgia is right there in Atlanta, right where you are. She said, contact the health department and they'll lead you in the right direction. So she gave me the telephone number of somebody to contact, which I did. And that person told me to contact the Department of Archives. So I did that. When I went down to the Department of Archives, that's when I knew that there was a rich history of midwifery, particularly the African American midwife that was housed right there. There were boxes and boxes and boxes of birth certificate records, records of midwives training, photos. Oh goodness, there was just so many things. I knew that it would take more than one visit to learn what I needed to learn. So over that year, I would go back and spend some time and gather some information. And then I realized that there was a listing of granny midwives that I thought would still be living. Whether they were still practicing or not, I'm not sure. But there was a listing of midwives that seemed like they would still be alive. And so I wrote down their names, I wrote down their addresses, and I wrote down their phone numbers. And one by one, I would call and I would introduce myself to them over the phone and let them know that I was interested in writing a book about Georgia's midwifery, and I would like to come to their home and interview them. And they were all excited about the prospect of me coming down to do this. And so me and my midwife from time to time over the years, we would just get in the car and travel mostly South Georgia. I don't remember going North Georgia. I don't think I went west or east. Most of these women were in the rural areas, which made sense. And I began to document their stories. And their stories were fabulous. These were women, black women that have been doing this for like years and years and decades. These were women who were not in the textbooks that I have been reading. This was our history right here. And so one lady I became friends with and continued to stay in touch with her until she passed away. She passed away about 2 or 3 years ago. That was Miss Arilla Smiley, and she lived in right outside of Albany in a little town called Camilla. But it's like saying Atlanta to Decatur. They're two counties that are right next door to each other. And the hanging scales that you see some of the midwives using today, one midwife that I interviewed, she gifted me with her hanging scale. So I have the hanging scale that she was given when she was a midwife. And I began to learn that the history of midwifery in the African community began, it's like, when do you say it began? It just came over during the transatlantic slave trade. It continued on through living on the plantations. It continued on during the days of segregation and Jim Crows. It just continued. And the art and the skills were passed down from grandmother to daughter, from grandmother to daughter. If there was a woman that was in the church that sensed that another woman had a knack, then she just brought her along, and that's how midwifery continued. And whatever tools and tricks of the trade that was passed on from coming here from Africa, that what was being taught. Well, there was a period of time where the health department decided they wanted to step in and kind of train and regulate midwifery in these rural areas. And so that's when some of the changes started happening. And these granny midwives would go to clinics where they would go for monthly meetings and learn different things about midwifery, about childbirth, about postpartum care. And they were also given a bag that had their basic supplies, and I say basic because it's not near as many things that we carried along with us, but it had their supplies that they needed at a birth, although they say that they had their own personal bag as well that had the things that were passed on to them by their mentors. But the health department provided them with training, and it provided them with their bags, and it provided them with the paperwork that they needed. They were responsible for signing the birth certificates for the babies. They were given a manual that they studied by, and then after their course of study, then they took a test, and if they passed the test, then they were certified, and they had to have a TB test, and they had to know how to read and write because they had to be able to fill out the birth certificates and so on and so forth. And they would be recertified every year. And this continued on until the early 80s when they discontinued certifying the granny midwives. And it wasn't until the last granny midwife retired that the health department, discontinued anything that had anything to do with midwifery. But anyways, I was happy to know that we had a history that we could be proud of, a history knowing that there were women whose shoulders we can stand on. And these women were inspiring to me. They were inspiring to me in the sense that there were midwives who were deciding what their parameters were, what they were going to what they were willing to do and what they weren't willing to do when it came to birthing women. And the two most distinct things, of course, to me were delivering breech babies and delivering multiples, like twins. While most midwives were afraid to take on breeches and twins and felt like these were high risk, when I would recall listening to the stories of the granny midwives, they didn't look at those as being high risk. They had no choice but to deliver those babies. I mean, we were talking about during days where black women were not allowed to have their babies in the hospital. And so the grand midwife had to know how to deliver a breech baby. She had to know how to deliver twin babies. She had to learn how to work with, moms that were presenting whatever was unexpected. And she did it because she had no choice. And so I wanted to be just like those women. I didn't want to be afraid of birth. I didn't want to be afraid of breech babies. I didn't want to be afraid of twin babies. I wanted to know how to do it. So I would listen to their stories, and while they would tell me their experiences delivering these breeches, and when they would tell me their experiences of delivering their twins, I would just close my eyes and imagine me doing that. Imagine where my hands were. Imagine what instructions they were giving the mothers. Well, at some point I realized that I needed to know just a little bit more. So it wasn't too much later, now we're still talking about the early 80s, that midwifery was popping up all across the nation. There were other women that were answering the call to midwifery, whether they're white, whether they're black, whether they're Hispanic. It was ringing everywhere. It was almost like the grandmothers, the grand midwives in their graves were saying, don't let this be a dying art. We're going to, inspire you through our stories that have been almost forgotten to continue. And so Georgia was no exception. And I think Ina May was traveling throughout the United States promoting the farm and the farm midwifery clinic, and women were coming to the farm. This farm is in Tennessee, Summertown, Tennessee. And they would come there, the women would come there to have a home birth-like experience. Although they were traveling from all over the United States, they were still having a home-like birth experience, even though they were away from home. And women like myself, although I didn't go, not at that time, but other women who were answering the call to midwifery would go to the farm and learn how to become a midwife and learn skills that were being taught by the midwives. Well, at the same time, Ina May Gaskin, who's a midwife who came in as a pioneer with this resurgence of midwifery, had just written a book called Spiritual Midwifery, and so she was going around the country promoting her book. There was another woman named Rahima Baldwin who wrote a book called Special Delivery, and she also had a childbirth education course called Informed Birth. And she too was going around the United States promoting her book, Special Delivery, and she was promoting her childbirth classes, Informed Home Birth. Both Special Delivery, the book, and Informed Birth, the childbirth classes, were designed for couples who were planning home births, just as Spiritual Midwifery was written for people who were planning home births, or either women or like myself who were on the path to midwifery. So these two women, they were all over the United States, just promoting home birth and promoting midwifery. And when they came here to Atlanta, I was at those events and had my ears perked to listen. And at one of those events, myself and several other women, we got together at the end of the workshop and decided that we wanted to learn more about each other, get to know each other, and perhaps start a study group. And so that's what happened. The women, including myself, we would get together once a month and have potluck lunches and just talk about midwifery. We'd talk about our birth experiences and just learn from each other's experiences. And then out of that group, that was the Southern Alliance of Midwives. And then out of that group, another organization came out of it to specifically focus on doing more in-depth studies and teaching and training. And that group was would soon become the Georgia Midwifery Association. So here I was now part of two active groups. One group where we just sat around and talked about our birth experiences and learned from each other, did each one teach one kind of thing. And then the other organization, we decided that what we wanted to do was really learn as much as that we could learn through textbooks, through guest speakers. And so once a month we would get together as well. And we would pick topics that we felt like we needed to know about midwifery, about pregnancy, about prenatal care, about breastfeeding, complications, interpreting lab results, newborn care, anything that we felt like we needed to know more about and to learn more hands-on skills. So sometimes that meant that we had doctors, nurses, lab technicians who would come in and teach us whatever hands-on skills that we needed to learn, and they were supportive of us. And today, the Georgia Midwifery Association still exists, and we've evolved from being a study group, although we do peer review, and when we do peer review, we still share our stories and bounce back and forth, what could I've done different? What would you have done? So we're still learning from each other's experiences, but we've also taken measures in midwifery and childbirth advocacy by presenting bills to legislation, trying to get midwifery, to be a licensed profession here in Georgia. We still have not reached that goal, but I think that each time we present a bill, we do get closer and closer. But that was pretty much the way that we got our education at that time. For 2 years, myself and my midwife, we volunteered at Grady Hospital, which is like a charity hospital that serves Fulton County and DeKalb County. And there we volunteered in labor and delivery on that floor. And we did that so that we could learn more about birth on the medical field, on the medical level, what goes on in the hospital. For me, it was teaching me where my parameters were, where I was in my lane and what was definitely out of my scope of practice. Today, midwifery students have an advantage over us in that now that midwifery has become more popular. We're talking about now being in 2014. Today there are schools where women can go and learn. There are distant learning programs where they can do self-study on their own and maybe go to the school site once a semester or once a quarter and get their skills. There are home corresponding courses that are available, and there are a lot more senior midwives that will take them on as apprentices. So in one sense, they get their didactics from, whether they're doing self-studying or whether they're in a school or doing a home corresponding course, in addition to applying what they're learning through an apprenticeship model with a mentor. Whereas we didn't have that. Back in the 70s and 80s, my generation of midwives were just coming back into being again. And so we had to each teach one another and learn from one another. And going to conferences that eventually, popped up, MANA being one of them, the Midwives Alliance of North America. One that I was also a part of, CPAD, which is the acronym of Childbirth Providers of African Descent. This is how we got our training. This is how we learned our skills, by going to these conferences and signing up for courses and classes that would enhance whatever it is that we felt like we needed to learn or to brush up on. And so when I think about the where I was 30-something years ago, and where I am today, and where I think that midwifery is taking us in the future, I do believe that there are more and more women who are interested in the art and the science of midwifery. There are more schools that are offering midwifery education. There are a lot more senior midwives that are serving as mentors out of this collective of women, and I think out of the growing popularity of families having their babies at home. There are more states now that are taking midwifery seriously and becoming licensed midwifery states. Georgia is not one of them. When I first started midwifery, there were 5 states where midwifery was lawful or legal. Today there are 27, and there might be a little bit more now. And one day I think that Georgia will become a licensed state. I used to feel a way about becoming licensed because I always felt like, this is something that we had to do. This is something that our grandmothers, learned to do because you had to be able to help somebody have a baby. Why do I have to, take a test and prove to somebody that I can do something that, was rightfully a part of our culture from the beginning of time? But I do realize that there are a younger generation of student midwives that do want to become certified, that do want to take home birth and midwifery to a level where they can practice in a lawfully and a licensed, kind of relaxed state. Although there'll probably be rules and regulations that will be put on them, I think that they want to be able to do it legitimately. I don't know if I'm in my latter 50s now, and I don't know if I want to be getting up at 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning, 20 years from now, delivering babies. And there are women who do come to me wanting me to be their mentor, and I do look at myself in the leadership position of midwifery, especially within our community. And I would like to be able to sign off for their skills to show that they have mastered certain basic skills of midwifery. So perhaps one day, if Georgia becomes a licensed state, one day I'll become a licensed midwife myself. Otherwise, I am perfectly happy practicing the way that I practice today. It's not uncomfortable to me. The state of Georgia, lawmakers, those that are in the health department, they know that we're here. They know that there are a growing number of families like myself that want to have home birth. They make provisions for people to be able to apply for birth certificates for their babies. And so they know that we're here. but they're not chasing us down. There's no witch hunting. I will knock on wood. We work pretty much collaboratively together, and if this type of relationship continues on till I retire, I'll be fine with that as well. But I do believe that midwifery is here to stay. Home birth is here to stay, and I believe that women and men who want to have their babies at home, if they are healthy, young, and they live, responsibly with their lifestyles, that they don't have any risk factors, they should have their babies at home. It's not a disease, it's not a medical disaster that's waiting to happen. I think that people should have the right to choose where they want to have their babies and with whom. And I do believe that there are women, men for that matter, but I think it's mostly women in home birth who want to be midwives and can learn how to practice safely and spiritually and just have a balance in their practice. Should have the right to choose what vocation or what profession that they want to go in and stay in. And so I am a midwife. I don't have any alphabets behind my name because I believe that all that does is separate people. And to me, whether you're a home birth midwife or whether you're a hospital midwife or whether you're a grand midwife or wherever you practice, a midwife is a